Hi, welcome to Left Foot Media. My name is Brendan Malone. Well, I've just finished watching the brand new Netflix TV series, The Keepers. It's the one that everyone is talking about, the crime drama, the priest who murdered the nun, or so the TV series wants to suggest to us. There's a lot of hype around about this at the moment. I thought I'd make this video in response because, in actual fact, when you stop and look at the show, I think it's actually really dangerous, this particular TV series, because of its completely unfounded and highly speculative nature. More on that in a second. Just a couple of things about the technical aspects of the show. It is fascinating. I think murder cases like this often are, particularly when there's a bit of history and when you sort of engage with the human element of it. And this series does that quite well. You really do meet the characters involved and you sort of get a feel for them. And it's, these sorts of things are always very interesting. It's very well filmed. It's got a quite a moving score. The musical score is actually quite impressive, and it all adds to quite a compelling and engaging series to watch. It's about 7 hours in total. I watched it over a couple of nights, and it's certainly riveting television in that regard. Some of the technical aspects that I thought were a little bit weak in places. There's a bit of padding, I felt. At times I felt like they padded the documentary out in places unnecessarily, and it sort of created a documentary that was perhaps longer than it needed to be. And it also weakened their final conclusion a little bit, because you're often waiting whole entire or several episodes before actually important pieces of evidence that really should be joined together in one single episode are sort of, are broken apart and presented sometimes hours apart, which, because of the padding, which made it a little bit weak. There's a bit of narrative confusion. At times this is about the murder of Sister Kathy. At other times, it's about the sexual abuse cover-up that happened in the Catholic Church in Baltimore, and there's a bit of narrative confusion at times as a result. I understand they were trying to link the two things together as part of this conspiracy theory, but even taking that into account, at times it did feel a little bit like they were headed down the direction of exploring the sexual abuse crisis at the expense of the actual whole premise of the documentary, which was supposed to be about the murder of Sister Kathy. And also in a couple of places there's a little bit of that cheesy reality TV setup type stuff, the typical fake investigative conversation that you see in reality TV shows where one person says to another person, well, Billy Bob obviously has some important information, so we need to make sure that he's the next person we talk to. As if this is some sort of organic conversation when clearly it's been orchestrated. So in many ways I think this is, and I'll explain more as I unpack some of the flaws, I think, the serious flaws, and why I think this is so problematic in this particular show. But basically, when you think about it, this is not really a documentary. This is actually a very impressive and well-made piece of reality TV. And reality TV is very different from documentary filmmaking. They're two different animals. They're two different types of things. And this really is, when you think about it, actually a piece of very well-crafted reality TV show material as opposed to a documentary series. So here's why I think that, and here's the major flaws. First of all, there is really a major lack of facts presented about these two murders. The murder of Sister Kathy and the subsequent murder of the young girl, Joyce Malecki, which happened in the same area not long after Sister Kathy's murder. We are given the basics, and we certainly investigate a lot of theories about the murder and the body and the finding of the body, but there's a whole lot of information which you get to the end of the series and you realise in a documentary you would be presented with a lot more hard factual information about the murder, about the movements of the people on the day, about how the body was found, about the pathology reports. We aren't even introduced to the pathologist who was involved in the pathology reports until much, much later in the series, I think episode 6 or 7 from memory. And even then, his involvement is very brief. And it's only to confirm or to discuss one particular aspect of the case, which is around whether or not there were maggots, or it's possible to have maggots on the body. There is a factual inaccuracy. There is a blatant lie told in this series, and the blatant lie is that recovered memories are a widely accepted and normal part of modern psychology. The exact opposite is true. Recovered memories are still highly controversial, and as I understand it, the majority consensus within the psychology community is that they are not reliable at all. This show claims the exact opposite is true. And that's obviously a problem, because that is not factually accurate. That's a blatant lie. If the consensus view is, and as my reading of the case is, that the consensus view is that recovered memories are not reliable. In fact, they have plenty of studies on this that raise serious doubts about their validity, then this creates another problem, which is probably the third point if I'm numbering them with the show, and that's that the entire premise of the show actually starts to fall down, because the entire premise that Father Maskell is responsible for this murder, that he either carried it out or ordered it of Sister Kathy, is built on only one important point, and that is that there was a recovered memory that one girl who was the victim of abuse remembered being shown the body of Sister Kathy and threatened. As an adult, many, many years later, she recovered this memory. Now, if that memory is not reliable, then the whole premise for this show completely falls down. And so I understand why they were not very honest and forthcoming about the fact that recovered memories are not considered to be reliable within the psychology community. As a result of that, they also try and discredit based on what we are told in the show, someone who is a highly respected and long-standing member of the psychology community. He's a professor, I believe, at Johns Hopkins, and they try to discredit him because of the simple fact that he appeared in a court case and he presented the consensus view that recovered memories are not reliable. And because he did that, they had to try and discredit him. So at one point they put up a list of cases, other different cases where he has presented expert evidence in, and they try and imply that he's some sort of Catholic stool pigeon, and the Catholic Church wheels him out and tells him what he has to say, and he just sort of he's almost like he's on the payroll or on the ideological payroll, if nothing else, and he just, because he's so in love with the Catholic Church, he'll do whatever they ask him to do, and he just presents any old thing, whether it's factual or not. Well, that's just nonsense, because the evidence he presented in this particular case, that recovered memories are dubious, and there are serious questions, they're controversial, it's seriously questionable how legitimate they should be taken. That view is the consensus view of psychology. And he can't be faulted for presenting that view, but they try and discredit him. Once again, all because the entire show hinges on that premise. Then the actual recovered memory itself and the way it's presented to us in the show should raise serious doubts and serious questions about its validity. You've got an adult woman who says that she had no memory of this being shown, this dead body at all, until many, 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 many years later, when a friend of hers, she's with a friend, they are looking over their high school yearbook, and her friend suddenly tells her, "Oh, don't you remember that's the murdered nun? That's your school." And it's after that, where that thought is planted in her mind, then she suddenly starts remembering this memory of being taken and shown the body and being threatened. And once again, that should raise serious questions, because if nothing else, doesn't that actually indicate, the way we're told the story, doesn't that indicate that the idea was planted in her mind, that it wasn't just something she suddenly remembered one day? Someone planted this idea about the murder and about her connection to it in her mind, and then she gets a recovered memory. I mean, that's seriously questionable. Not only that, but they don't really explore her recovered memory in much detail. She claims that she saw the body, that there were maggots on the face, and that she was threatened, but maybe she didn't remember much. You see, but this is important to know. How much does she or does she not remember? Because it really goes to the heart of the accusation they're making in the series, that Father Maskell murdered or orchestrated the murder of Sister Kathy. But does she remember what time of the day it was, where the body was? You know, all these important details we're not really told. And yet, once again, you would think that these would be important to the central premise of the show. The whole question about the maggots is completely irrelevant when you stop and think about it. You know, yes, as the pathologist says, his report indicated there were maggots found in the mouth. And she claims she was wiped maggots off the face, but that is not a substantial piece of evidence. You see, even a fake memory that someone has could quite conceivably, in fact, it would quite conceivably, if it involved a dead body, also involve things like flies and maggots. These are things that are commonly associated with dead bodies, are they not? And so I don't see how that actually proves that it doesn't prove her memory's true at all. It doesn't substantiate the memory in any way. All it does is says, yes, that maggots were found. And this is important, because we're not told when exactly she was shown the body. Now, this is important because when did the maggots appear, and when was she shown the body in her memory? And do the two line up? It's one thing to say, well, we found maggots all these months later, because it took many months to discover the body. We found maggots many months later when we discovered the body. But when was she shown the body? you see how these important bits of information are missing, and you get to the end of the series like I did, and you realise, hold on, there's all these important facts that we just weren't told, and you really need to know in order to substantiate the claim that they are trying to make here. Not only that, but the show involves accusations against two different uncles from two different families. So two men from two different families are accused of being the murderer. The show tells us explicitly that there is no connection between these two men, so they don't know each other, so they both can't be the murderer, right? There's no connection between these two men. Not only that, but there's no connection made or shown or even proven between these men and Father Maskell. What's the connection? Where is the connection? Because surely, again, the whole premise is that Father Maskell is the murderer, or he orchestrated the murder. Well, what's the connection with these men? None of that is presented. It's so speculative. It's just not funny. And this is why I think it's really dangerous, because it's a trial by media, and it's based on rumours and recovered memories, and it's just not reliable information at all. The interview with Ed, who's a lot older, the guy Edgar, who's one of the accused, they interview him, and he's a lot older now, and clearly his mental faculties are going. And I felt that to be quite exploitative. I have first-hand experience of older people with, where their faculties are starting to go. And I can tell you that interview to me just seemed very exploitative. You can't consider that reliable at all, what he was saying and what he wasn't saying, or how he said things. It was so clear and obvious when you watch that interview that effectively, you've got someone who's very suggestible, and he could be saying things because he thinks they want them to say that. He could be remembering things that aren't true because of the way his mind is working. You just don't know. And so I found that a bit exploitative, actually. There's big questions about Coob, the guy they were calling him Father Gerald Coob, but the series actually indicates that he was never ordained. Initially, he was never ordained when he knew her. They were calling him Father Jerry, though, at the beginning. But so Coob, that guy Coob, who went on to subsequently leave the Catholic Church and become a Methodist minister, I think it was, and marry another woman. Now, there's some interesting things about him. First of all, we are told in this documentary series that one of the lead detectives in the case said he either did it or he knows who did it. Now, he told a journalist that, and the journalist actually said, I would not trust what this man tells you, because this police officer, clearly he spent a lot of time as an investigative journalist who wrote the original article about this whole case, this big lengthy article. And he obviously spent a lot of time with this police officer before he died. And his reaction was, you need to be really careful about what this man tells you. Now, the series, though, doesn't really go into much questioning about it. Certainly, there's a little bit of questioning him and these allegations against him, but it doesn't really go into a lot. Yet, once again, there's a third party now who's not Father Maskell, who has a police officer, one of the original police officers investigating the case, who is saying, this guy either did it or he knows who did it. They never explain why the police officer made that comment, though. And I think if you're going to put something like that in your documentary series, then you do have an obligation, I think, to follow that strand of evidence and try and find out more, or try and present why it was that he said that. What evidence did they think they had against this particular individual? Not only that, but Coob appeared to present two completely contradictory points of evidence. Very early on in the series, he says that they were in love with each other. He was so infatuated with her, he sat down on the back of the field one day, or the school somewhere, or wherever it was, and he said to her, you've got this decision to make about whether you're going to make your final vows and become a nun, talking to Sister Kathy. And he says, I've got this decision coming up about whether I make my final vows and get ordained and become a priest. He says, I don't want you to become a nun. I don't want to become a priest. I want you to leave with me and we'll get married. Now, he says to us that Sister Kathy told him, no, you're going to be a priest, I'm going to be a nun. And it sort of implies that despite the fact that there might have been some infatuation and romantic feelings, that she was very committed to being a nun, and that was the decision she'd made. But then later, several episodes later, we are presented with contradictory evidence, completely contradictory evidence, when we're presented with a letter that she wrote to him, which clearly implies they were having a sexual relationship. She professes her love for him in the letter, explicitly states, I love you, and the whole thing is that she wants to be with him. It's and it's never explained, because this appears to be completely contradictory, and it's never explained properly what that contradiction is, or whether there was even a contradiction. Maybe the timeline's not right, but it's not explained to us properly. But it certainly, for me, raises some questions about Coob. And these questions are They kind of explored, but not really, because they're desperate to paint this connection between Father Maskell. They're desperate to try and prove that Father Maskell is the killer. So on top of being an abuser, he's also a killer. And the problem is they just start ignoring all of this contradictory evidence. They start ignoring all the questionable factual stuff, and they start engaging in all sorts of wild speculation and conjecture instead. And when you get to the end of the show, you realise one very important thing. Not once in the series do they actually present any evidence, any physical evidence, any independent corroborating evidence to link Father Maskell, to this murder. They don't. There is no chain of evidence linking him. The only thing they rely on is one very questionable recovered memory that happened as an adult many years later. That's it. If you take out that recovered memory of that woman who claims she was shown the body, then there is no evidence at all. There's no physical evidence. And they don't even go into important details like what was Father Maskell's timeline on the day. No one appears to have investigated that important point. Did he go to her apartment on the day of the crime? Did he talk to the people who are possibly his co-conspirators who carried out the crime? You see, if you're going to accuse someone of a crime like this, you've actually got to provide a substantial case. There's got to be a systematic case. You've got to put evidence on the table. None of that is presented. And you realise, oh my gosh, this is all just emotive speculation and conjecture without any substantial evidence. Not only that, but I read an article from just a couple of days ago that there is no DNA evidence at all. They tested the DNA evidence and they exhumed Father Maskell's body and tested his DNA. And his DNA was not found at the scene of the crime at all. So clearly this is a big hurdle. And this evidence was published in the newspapers in Baltimore, I believe, just a couple of days before this new series went to air. Now, once again, this is important because if you're going to make an accusation like this, you really do need to present, at the very least, a systematic account that shows that, not just you're accusing him because of someone had a recovered memory, but here's his movements on the day and here's how it could have been possible, here's what he did afterwards, etc., etc., etc. None of that sort of important information is given, and I think possibly it's because it either doesn't exist or they don't know whether it exists because they haven't actually investigated that. This then brings in towards the very end of the series, they bring in the murder of Joyce Malecki, the second young girl. They only really briefly touch on her murder. And they try and link her murder to Father Maskell in I think, the most outrageously flimsy kind of way. The reporter has a card that was sent to her family. See, Father Maskell was a parish priest, one of 3 parish priests in a parish, and Joyce Malecki's family were parishioners there. And at Christmas time, a Christmas remembrance card was sent to her family. It's a typed up, printed card from all 3 of the parish priests, not just Father Maskell. It's not handwritten, it's typed up. And it simply says, they show you the card on TV, it simply says that they are going to be remembering their family and their loss, their loved one, obviously Joyce, who died, in their Christmas Day masses. This is, as I understand, it's quite a normal practice in the States, in parishes like that. And so there's nothing personal about that. It's not a handwritten card. It's signed by all 3 priests. It doesn't mention Joyce by name even. It's just this typed up generic thing. Your family member will be remembered by us. In other words, we'll be saying a prayer for you and your loved one in our masses. And that's all it is. And not only that, but this card, it's generic, it's common practice. Everyone who had a death in the parish, probably in the year before or in the previous couple of years, would have received one of these cards. They go through the parish records and they send them out to these families. It's a sort of a goodwill gesture. So there's nothing personal to it. It's not handwritten, and it's not signed either by Father Maskell. It's typed up. All 3 parish priests are typed. He's last on the list, in fact, of names, and it's almost certain that the parish secretary would have produced a whole lot of those cards and they would have just all been sent out to the families. That the priests probably just said, oh, can you do this? It's that time of year, let's do this thing again, right? And that's presented. It's so outrageously tenuous that it's just not funny. That is not evidence of anything. It's not a real link. It's not substantial enough. And yet they have indicated in the show, they've dropped that in there as if somehow you should be thinking he's murdered 2 people. They haven't even established the fact that he's murdered the first person, Sister Kathy, yet, and yet they are dropping in Joyce Malecki as well and trying to, with even less evidence, trying to make you think that he's killed her as well. What I think this show does is it really conflates 2 separate things, the sexual abuse and the murder, and it tries to tie them together in this big grand conspiracy theory, and that's really problematic, and it's very confusing, particularly for viewers who aren't going to think critically about the issue. because when you think critically, you realise you need to separate these two things out a bit more. And just because this horrific abuse happened, it doesn't mean that the person who perpetrated the abuse was also the perpetrator of a murder, or there was some grand conspiracy and attempt to cover up. Because he's accused the Catholic Church, he's accused the police, local government of all being in on this big plan to cover up the murder or several murders. Now, this kind of doesn't make sense when you stop and think about it, because the central premise of the show is that this man, this Father Maskell, was so well connected that he could get away with murder. But then the whole reason he had for murdering this nun was supposedly because she was going to expose him for being a sexual abuser. Well, if he's so well connected he can get away with murder, then why is he not well connected enough to get away with sexual abuse? Now, that's an important question, isn't it? Because that really challenges the central premise of this show, especially when you consider the fact they don't present any strong evidence here. They just present conjecture and little bits of circumstantial stuff and a recovered memory. And the recovered memory doesn't really make sense either. Like, this Father Maskell was so desperate to hide his criminal offending, he murders someone, but then he goes and takes a young girl and he shows her the dead body, which links him to a murder now. Why would he do that if he was trying to hide criminal offending? Wouldn't he be keeping these young women away from the body? Because he's killed the sister, who supposedly, without any evidence that she's actually going to do this, once again, it's all just conjecture, people's feelings about what they think she would have done if she had known this information, and what they thought she was going to do. There's this whole conjecture about the fact that, he's murdered her because of the fact he's trying to hide his crimes. Well, then why would he be showing people the dead body? None of this really makes sense when you think about it. And I think the big problem is they've tried to conflate these two things. Now, I did a bit of reading about the director, Ryan White, and I discovered something interesting about him. It's being reported in the news. It's no secret or anything, but he's actually directly linked to this case. His aunt was a pupil at that school. She was taught by Sister Kathy, and his aunt was a classmate of the lady who was known as Jane Doe in this TV series, The Keepers. And I would say that explains a lot about why this is not a very balanced show. This is why I think it's reality TV. It's not a documentary. A documentary looks at the evidence and presents all of the facts, and it'll follow the facts wherever they lead, and even conflicting information. It'll be fully honest about that. This show very much follows a particular idea. It follows a theory. And the theory is Father Maskell murdered Sister Kathy, and also they indicate Joyce Malecki as well. And what the whole show is constructed to try and prove that point. And that's different from a documentary. That's an advocacy piece, and the way it's constructed is very much reality TV. It's not very balanced, and they present, as I said, a blatant falsehood in this show. As soon as I heard that statement about recovered memories, I knew there was an issue, there was a problem with The Keepers. As soon as I heard that statement, trying to claim that recovered memories are a normal and widely accepted part of psychology, my first thought was, okay, what else are they not telling the truth about? Because this is simply not true. And I think basically the series is one long conspiracy theory. It's a fishing expedition. As I said, when you get to the end, you realise they have not presented any compelling evidence or a systematic case linking Father Maskell and showing how he could have carried out this crime. They haven't done any of that. They have just thrown out wild conjecture, and all sorts of emotion is tied up in it. Very emotional score. It's very well filmed, and it emotionally tries to get you to buy into this emotional feeling, oh, he must have done it. But that's an emotion. It's not evidence. It's not how we try crimes. And this is why I think it's really dangerous and very problematic. Because he's accused different people now, and he's basically what this is. It's not a documentary. This is a public trial by media of certain people. They've been accused of this murder, and they are being tried in the media, and in the most circumstantial and flimsy kind of evidence, if you want to call it evidence, even being put forward for this. And the problem is that that's extremely dangerous for individuals who might well be innocent, who are then implicated in something they had nothing to do with, and all of a sudden the general public at large starts to believe, because this is a spectacular show. The allegations are very spectacular. It's widespread. It'll go all around the world. And it's quite conceivable that a lot of people, if these people are innocent, will wrongly believe them to be guilty of murder when there is no substantial evidence backing that up. Even when you think about Ed, and at the end he sort of admits that he was the one who rang up that television show. But people do that. People do stupid things. They either prank do prank calls like that, or they have psychological issues that makes them feel that they want to inject themselves into crimes like this, and they have nothing to do with the crime itself, but they feel like they want to be important, so they do things like ring up shows and pretend they know information that they don't because it makes them feel special. That's possible that that's the extent of his involvement in this, even if it's true. As an elderly man, his faculties are good enough to actually remember accurately, yeah, he did. And the whole connection with the necklace was so dubious. That necklace, there is no strong link at all proving that that was the necklace that Sister Kathy purchased. And yet they have created this whole narrative around this necklace as if it actually is the real engagement gift that she bought. For all we know, Ed bought that himself, or he stole it, because he clearly has a history of criminal offending and stealing things. The show tells us that. It's quite conceivable he stole it and gave it to his wife. Or maybe it was just some cheap thing that he bought and gave to his wife. There's no indication that this is the actual thing, but oh man, they really go to great lengths to try and speculate about why. And the only real, and it's very tenuous, is that the fiancé at the time, the green is the birthstone for his birth month, and that's the only link. Oh, and it's a bell shape, so is that a wedding bell? Like, it's so speculative. And I found that particular aspect of it, that to me, that's a classic example of the whole show and the problem here. The problem is it's just so highly speculative. Now, the other way in which this is really dangerous, and I think this is even more problematic again, is that the fact that it actually endangers the chance of a successful prosecution. If they do find the real person, and they find who is guilty of this, the killing of Sister Kathy and Joyce Malecki, or maybe they're two separate murderers, I don't know. Because of the show, the real guilty parties now have the potential to get before a judge and a jury and say, hey, well, remember that show The Keepers? They said someone else did it. It can't be me. So this is why speculation like this is really dangerous. And like I said, this is more like reality TV show. It's not really a documentary. It's presented as a documentary. It's not. It's a reality TV show, and I think it's extremely problematic. And what it's really highlighted for me is that shows like this, the same with Making of a Murderer, there was so much of Making of a Murderer where it was so speculative, and they were so desperate to try and prove this guy innocent, when in actual fact the evidence quite strongly points the other way. There was so much conjecture going on. And I think The Keepers is even more highly contentious than Making of a Murderer was, because I think there's far more conjecture going on here, and it's far more problematic. And what it's really shown for me is that these sorts of shows have a very limited use. The limited effectiveness, if you like, is the fact that they might invigorate people to remember something about a cold case, or to suddenly come forward and confess something that they've been hiding for years. And so it can be good in that regard. But that's the extent of it. When you get people like they have in the show who actually then go down the rabbit hole and try and make, effectively they are trying and charging and putting people on trial for murders without any real substance, without being the police, without conducting a proper investigation of the evidence, I think that's when things get really dangerous, and we end up with trial by media, and it's just so dangerous and problematic. So as I said, watch it, see what you think. I'd love to hear your views on it. And as I said, the big problem with the show, and if you disagree with me, you think I'm wrong, then I want you to tell me in the comments section, what was the actual chain of evidence? What was the physical evidence? Not just speculation and accusation, but where's the evidence? Where's the systematic case that shows that Father Maskell could have actually committed this murder? Where's the systematic case? Where's the evidence linking him to the crime and the crime scene? Not just the fact that they taught in the same school, but the fact that he's actually linked to the murder. Show us the actual evidence. Show us a consistent chain of evidence. This show doesn't do that. It presents all sorts of wild theories and just sort of, it's like some sort of fishing expedition. My only hope is that somehow that the truth might come out, and this might, because of this, there's such attention on this case now, that it might result in justice for Sister Kathy and Joyce Malecki after all these years. But who knows? I haven't got my fingers crossed though. I'm hoping, but who knows? Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time on Left Foot Media.